The third shift at Seattle General stretched like a held breath. Fluorescent panels hummed their white noise hymn above the ICU, casting the kind of light that made 2 a.m. feel like the bottom of the world. Room 347 lay at the far end of the corridor, isolated from the busier beds, its monitors cycling through their mechanical litany: beep, breathe, measure, repeat. Danielle Ross stood at the bedside, her hands moving with the precise economy of someone who'd done this 10,000 times before, adjusting the fall line that threaded into the colonel's scarred forearm with the same attention she'd give a diffusing kit. The needle went in clean. No wasted motion. No hesitation. The patient in the bed had been medevaced from Baghdad 3 weeks prior, shrapnel embedded in the soft tissue adjacent to his T9 vertebra like a permanent houseguest nobody wanted. Colonel Marcus Reed, age 42, 17 years of active duty with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. The chart was thick: blast injuries, partial hearing loss in the left ear, 3 surgeries already, 2 more pending. But Danielle didn't read the file like most nurses did. She read the body itself. The way his chest rose and fell. The color of his skin beneath the bruising. The tremor in his right hand when the sedatives wore thin. She could feel what numbers couldn't tell her, the way a musician hears the broken string before the tuning fork confirms it. The colonel stirred slightly as she repositioned the monitor leads, his eyes still pinned by propofol, but his body knew her presence. Or something did. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled against the hospital blanket. Danielle didn't acknowledge it. She simply moved to the 4-pump, checked the drip rate, 18 milliliters per hour, and made a notation in the electronic chart with 2 quick keystrokes. Everything routine. Everything invisible. What she didn't know yet was that someone was watching. Dr. James Mercer stood at the nurse's station 20 feet away, his white coat pristine enough to hurt to look at, his tie knotted with the kind of precision that suggested he'd practiced knots the way other men practice speeches. He was tall in the way that made people assume he was important, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and ice the color of polished slate. His smile, when he deployed it, arrived like a scheduled flight, on time, appropriate, utterly empty of anything resembling genuine human warmth. He was studying Danielle Ross with the careful attention of a man who'd just noticed an inconsistency in his ledger. It wasn't her competence that bothered him. Competence was expected. What bothered Mercer was the way she'd paused that morning during rounds while reviewing the supply orders for Colonel Reed's upcoming debridement. A simple pause. A 3-second hesitation while reviewing the surgical kit manifest. Her eyes had moved across the line items: sterile drapes, suction tubing, hemostatic agents, and then stopped. Just stopped. On the entry that read Advanced Surgical Supply Kit, Model ASKR 1200, Quantity, 3, Unit Cost, $8,000. For a routine debridement, you needed 1 kit. Maybe 1.5 if the wound was complicated. Mercer had ordered 3. The hospital would bill the Department of Defense $24,000 for those kits. The actual cost to acquire them was $1,200. The difference, the real money, the sustainable, recurring, month-after-month beautiful difference, went into a carefully nested offshore account that Mercer maintained with the hospital's procurement director, a man named Vincent Castellano who had the kind of gambling debts that made him reliably cooperative. $40,000. Every single month. Just from the DOD contracts alone. That didn't count the private insurance overcharges, the phantom specialist consultations, the medications that got billed at 3 times their wholesale price. Mercer had built a system so elegant it could run itself. He'd become indispensable to the hospital's bottom line precisely because he was bleeding the system dry in ways that the CFO could celebrate as excellent cost recovery and maximized utilization of supplier relationships. And now there was a night shift nurse who paused at numbers. Danielle checked the monitor again. Oxygen saturation 96%. Heart rate 68. Blood pressure 124/78. The colonel's body was healing the way bodies do when the trauma isn't recent enough to still be actively killing them. She made another note and turned to move to the medication cart, where she kept a physical count of the controlled substances. Hospital policy required an inventory check every 8 hours. Danielle did one every 4 hours, always during the quiet part of the night when nobody was watching, always documented in her own handwriting in a private log she kept beneath the loose false bottom of her locker. Not because she was paranoid. Because Captain Danielle Ross had spent 5 years embedded with the first SFODD, and she'd learned a long time ago that the quiet people who noticed everything tended to survive longer than the ones who didn't. The morphine count showed a discrepancy again. 2 milliliters missing from yesterday's inventory. Small. Almost negligible. The kind of loss you could attribute to evaporation or measurement error or the simple mathematics of a busy ICU where people got tired and made small mistakes. But Danielle had been doing this for 14 years, and she'd learned to read numbers the way other people read faces. The discrepancy had been there for 3 days. Same 2 milliliters. Same time of day. Same pattern as she'd seen twice before in her career, once in Phoenix at Mercy General, once in San Diego at Oak Creek Memorial, and both times it had preceded a bigger problem. A theft, properly documented. A diversion scheme, methodically executed. A system being tested for its breaking points. She made a note in the official logbook. Morphine count variance, 2 milliliters unaccounted. Recount performed, confirmed. Discrepancy documented. Patient request correlates. She didn't note what she was actually thinking. Someone was skimming the controlled substance inventory. Someone with access. Someone careful enough to do it in amounts small enough that a cursory audit might miss them. Someone who'd done this before. The medication cart hissed slightly as she closed the drawer, the kind of sound a tired person might not notice but that Danielle heard like a distant alarm. She'd learned to listen to the hospital's sounds the way soldiers listen to the sounds of a city they're occupying, the hum that means safety, the change in pitch that means trouble. The ventilator in 347 wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The fluorescent panels buzzed overhead like trapped insects. Somewhere down the corridor, someone's pump beeped its completion tone. All normal. All expected. All the background noise of a hospital that didn't know it was being robbed by its own doctors. Danielle moved back to room 347 to check the medication infusion one final time. The propofol drip was running clear through the 4-line, delivering its molecules of unconsciousness in steady measured doses. 16 hours left of sedation, per the anesthesia notes. The colonel would wake tomorrow afternoon, assuming nothing went wrong. Assuming the next procedure went as planned. Assuming the people he trusted actually knew how to cut him without cutting something that kept him alive. It was then that their eyes met. Colonel Reed's pupils had contracted just enough to suggest a moment of semi-consciousness, that threshold state where sedation doesn't quite hold but the body can't quite break through. His eyes, grey like winter, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving things, fixed on her face with the intensity of a man whose brain was trying to process something his chemicals wouldn't allow him to speak. His mouth moved silently. His right hand rose maybe 2 inches from the blanket. And something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Or the attempt at it. Or something else entirely that his sedated mind couldn't quite articulate. Danielle didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Simply pressed her hand briefly against his shoulder, the kind of touch that said rest, that said safe, that said I'm here, and then she turned away to continue her notes. The colonel's hand fell back to the mattress. His eyes closed. The moment passed like a stone dropping through water. Dr. Mercer watched the entire exchange from his vantage point at the nurse's station. He noted how calmly she'd responded to the patient's agitation. He noted the precise duration of her touch, 2 seconds, maybe 3. He noted that she hadn't called for assistance, hadn't panicked, hadn't done anything that might draw attention to the interaction. He noted all of it, and he filed it away in that part of his mind that was always calculating, always assessing, always identifying problems that needed solutions. A quiet nurse who asked questions about supply orders. A careful nurse who counted medications on a schedule that didn't align with policy. A composed nurse who moved like someone used to managing critical situations without announcing that she was doing so. Someone who'd just shown a strange kind of familiarity with a patient who'd been sedated the entire time he'd been at Seattle General. Danielle Ross was a problem. Mercer had a gift for identifying them early. He also had a gift for solving them. He turned away from the nurse's station and headed toward his office on the 3rd floor, his mind already moving through the necessary steps. Documentation could be fabricated. Medication errors could be suggested. A pattern could be established. The system he'd built was stronger than one nurse, no matter how careful she was. The system had money behind it. The system had allies. The system had momentum. And Mercer had been running systems like this long enough to know that the best way to handle a threat was to make it seem like the threat was creating problems for itself. The next morning, a memo would appear on the ICU board. It was routine, administrative, the kind of thing nobody paid attention to. But it was there. Danielle's 3rd shift would be extended by 2 hours. She'd be assigned exclusively to the more critical patients. Her break times would be staggered in a way that made it harder for her to reconcile her medication counts at a consistent time. And Dr. Mercer would begin the slow, careful process of creating a paper trail that would eventually explain why she was no longer welcome at Seattle General. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. Morning rounds at Seattle General moved like clockwork on the 3rd week. Danielle held the colonel's chart, reading vitals from the monitor, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation climbing, kidney function stabilizing. The sedation was lightening. He was waking. She'd noticed something else though, something that had started 3 days ago when she was pulling narcotic counts from the automated dispensary. A morphine discrepancy. Not massive, maybe 4 milliliters over 2 shifts, but enough to trigger the protocol she'd been trained on. Report it. Always report it. The colonel's daughter stood on one side of the bed, his elderly mother on the other, both watching Danielle work with the kind of gratitude people reserve for those who hold their loved ones' lives in careful hands. Danielle waited for Dr. Mercer to round on this patient like he did every morning at 8:51 a.m. Precise. Punctual. The kind of precise that makes everything else look like chaos. When he arrived, she didn't hesitate. The family was there. That was the point. Witnesses. Protocol. The words came out steady and professional, her voice carrying the weight of someone whose job included noticing what shouldn't be there. Doctor, I've identified a morphine discrepancy in the narcotic count over the past 48 hours. Additionally, I wanted to flag a pattern I've noticed in the supply orders for this unit. Saline solutions are being billed to the Department of Defense at $300 per unit when the hospital's cost basis is approximately $2. That's roughly a 14,900% markup on volume orders, which seems to exceed standard government contract rates. She kept her eyes level. Professional. The kind of tone that leaves no room for dismissal. Mercer's face changed. Not visibly angry. Worse than that. His expression went perfectly, completely still, like someone had paused a video at the exact moment before the explosion. The colonel's daughter looked between Danielle and the doctor. The mother's hand tightened on her son's arm. 3 seconds passed. 4. Mercer's jaw worked once, and then his smile came back, but it had teeth now, the kind of smile that comes right before something shatters. Nurse Ross, he said, his voice still cultured, still measured, but carrying an edge like a blade being drawn across marble. A word. Now. He didn't wait for her to move. He turned and walked into the hallway, and Danielle followed, already knowing what was coming, already feeling the weight of it settle across her shoulders like a command jacket. He stopped 3 feet outside the patient room, close enough that the family could see but far enough that they'd have to lean to hear. He kept his voice low, which somehow made it worse than shouting. Quiet fury has more reach than noise. Your clinical judgment is dangerously incompetent, he said, each word clipped and precise as a surgical incision. You've questioned 3 separate medication protocols this week. You've disrupted family time with paranoid accounting theories. And frankly, I'm documenting a pattern of instability that's affecting patient care. You're making accusations about supply chain management, something entirely outside your scope of practice, in front of families who are already frightened and vulnerable. That's not advocacy, Nurse Ross. That's sabotage. The Colonel's mother had stepped to the doorway. Danielle could feel her looking, feel the confusion blooming in that older woman's mind. Danielle's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. Her face remained exactly what it had been, level, attentive, professional, even though something in her chest had gone cold and clear, the way water freezes into glass. Mercer kept talking. I'm placing a note in your personnel file regarding this interaction. A formal warning. And I'll be monitoring your clinical decisions very carefully going forward. We cannot have nurses making baseless financial accusations during patient rounds. Is that clear? Danielle waited. 3 full seconds. Let him feel the weight of her silence. Then she looked directly at him, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave, carrying a flatness that can only come from someone who has watched worse things than this man could imagine. You bill the government $300 for saline bags that cost $2, and I'm the danger in this room. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back into the patient room, her spine straight as rebar, and resumed checking the fall line as if he'd never spoken at all. The next morning, the break room felt different. Not visibly. Same coffee maker. Same fluorescent lights buzzing their tired hum. Same plastic chairs and old magazines scattered across the table. But when Danielle entered at 6:15 a.m., the room emptied within 30 seconds. A respiratory therapist stood up mid-sandwich. A phlebotomist gathered her things with sudden purpose. A medical assistant who'd been complaining about her night shift suddenly remembered she needed to review charts. One by one, they left, the door closing behind them with a soft hiss. Danielle made her coffee. Black. No sugar. She sat down at the table and opened her lunch container, grilled chicken, rice, a container of steamed vegetables that tasted like exactly what they were. Fuel. Nothing more. She ate alone. The fluorescent lights continued their buzz. Outside the break room windows, San Antonio was waking up, the city moving forward with its millions of people, none of whom would ever know that a nurse had just been publicly humiliated by a man who was stealing from the government and had decided that she was the problem. By Wednesday, Danielle ate in her car. By Thursday, she was eating at her desk during charting. By Friday, she'd stopped eating at the hospital altogether. The written warning had appeared on the unit's public disciplinary board that first morning, posted on the cork wall where every staff member would see it, formal and typed and irrevocable. Medication error, Nurse D. Ross, corrective action required. Except there had been no medication error. The morphine count had been accurate. But Mercer had documented it anyway, creating the paper trail that would justify everything that came next. He started calling her Angel in staff meetings. Not with kindness. With the kind of mocking emphasis that turns kindness into a knife. Let's see if our Angel has any earthly concerns about this protocol, he'd say, looking at her with barely concealed contempt. Other doctors laughed. Some didn't. None of them spoke up. The silence of colleagues is its own form of violence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching the Colonel watch her. During vitals checks, his eyes would track her movements, his brow furrowing, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to pull a name from some locked compartment of memory. She'd check his blood pressure, listen to his heart, adjust his oxygen cannula, and he'd stare at her with a confusion that seemed almost painful. Like he knew something. Like she meant something. Like there was a connection there that his drugged and fractured mind couldn't quite access. 3 times she caught him mouthing a single syllable. A sound. The beginning of a word. But it never completed. She said nothing. She checked her equipment. She charted her observations. She maintained her composure with the kind of discipline that comes from having stood in positions where one sound, one crack in her voice, or one tear, would have cost lives. The kind of discipline that doesn't ask why it's necessary. It just is. The hospital moved around her like water around a stone. She was still there. Still present. But she was no longer part of the current. Mercer continued building his file. Fabricated medication errors. Claims of insubordination. Documented concerns about her fitness for duty. Each one was false. Each one was meticulous. Each one was designed to build a structure that would eventually collapse the one thing that mattered: her career, her credential, the identity she'd spent 14 years constructing inside this building. At 1:33 a.m. on a Tuesday, the monitors began their screaming. BP 60 over 40. Dropping. The colonel's abdomen rigid and distending like he was being inflated from the inside, and Danielle knew before she pulled back the blanket what had ruptured. Splenic artery. The kind of bleed that doesn't announce itself with drama, it whispers, then it kills you in your sleep. She hit the rapid response button with the heel of her hand. The sound was a single chirp, electronic and small, swallowed immediately by the monitor's desperate beeping. His heart rate climbing, 142, 156, 168, a rhythm that said his body knew before his medicated brain did. She started compressions without waiting for orders, muscle memory taking over, her palms locked and shoulders driving down in rhythm with her breathing. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The mattress yielded under her weight like it had been designed for this exact moment. The code team moved like water through the ER doors, respiratory therapy with the crash cart, 2 trauma nurses she'd worked with for 7 years, and Dr. Mercer arriving exactly 147 seconds after the alarm, his white coat already unbuttoned as if he'd been waiting in the hallway for the colonel to crash. He didn't run. Walking that particular speed that said, "I am in control of everything happening in this room." His eyes swept the monitors, the 4 lines, the compression rhythm Danielle maintained. "Continue compressions," he said. Not to her. Just to the room. "Let me see the abdomen." Danielle kept her hands locked, kept the rhythm steady. Her shoulders burning already, muscles firing in that familiar way from training scenarios that never quite prepared you for the actual weight of a human chest resisting your attempt to restart their heart. Mercer pulled back the blanket, and she saw his jaw tighten. That was the tell. That was him understanding what she'd already known: the colonel's abdomen was a taut, distended landscape of internal bleeding. Severed splenic artery, Mercer said, and the words had the shape of a conclusion already made. He needs emergency surgery. Now. Someone get me the on-call surgical attending. And neurosurgery. The shrapnel near his spine, if he's going to surgery anyway, we address both issues. One of the trauma nurses was already moving, already reaching for the phone mounted on the wall. Danielle kept compressions going. 30. 2 breaths. 30. The colonel's chest rose under her hands, mechanical and obedient. His heart rate on the monitor still climbing, 172, 185, 198, that electrical storm that meant the body was asking for help no medication could provide. Then silence fell, the kind of silence that happens when you realize the person calling for surgical backup isn't getting answers. Mercer took the phone from the nurse's hand. His voice when he spoke was the voice of someone who'd already calculated several steps ahead. Reasonable. Calm. The voice of a man holding something over someone else's head. "This is Dr. Mercer at Seattle General, Trauma Bay 4. I need the emergency surgical attending for a penetrating abdominal trauma with splenic artery hemorrhage and possible spinal cord compromise. The patient is Delta Force. Medevac from Baghdad. Yes, active duty. I understand liability concerns, absolutely, I do. Catastrophic spinal injuries post-op, potential Department of Defense review if anything goes sideways. No, you're completely right. Career implications. Let me have someone else take this case." He paused. Listened. "I completely understand. Thank you for the clarity." He hung up. Danielle kept compressions going. 30. 2 breaths. 30. The room had gone very still, the way it goes still before something breaks. Mercer dialed again. His thumb moved with precision across the phone's keypad. This is Dr. Mercer at Seattle General with an emergency surgical consult. I have a Delta Force colonel with a severed splenic artery, active hemorrhage, and I understand you might have concerns about liability exposure on a special assignment patient. Yeah. Career implications if anything goes wrong post-op. Yes, sir, I completely respect that position. Another refusal. She heard the clatter of the phone being hung up at the other end. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30. Mercer made the third call. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. Each one following the same script. Each one using the same careful language about liability concerns and career implications. Each one treating the refusal like he'd expected it, like he'd somehow already known the answer before he asked the question. The surgical team at Mercy Hospital. The trauma attending at St. David's. The on-call neurosurgeon who'd just finished a 12-hour shift. The trauma fellow who'd been called into an ethics meeting anyway and couldn't step away. By the 6th call, Danielle understood what was happening. Mercer wasn't trying to get the colonel a surgeon. He was making calls to ensure that no surgeon would touch this case. The words were all wrong, all correct, technically. Correct phrasing about legal liability, about career risk, about the careful documentation that would protect any physician who walked away. But the orchestration was perfect. The timing was methodical. The reminders were just helpful suggestions, just observations, just reasonable cautions that made it seem like the smartest decision in the world to refuse. She kept her hands locked. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The colonel's heart rate on the monitor was starting to climb beyond sustainable, 198, 206, 210. The monitor was showing atrial fibrillation now, the electrical chaos that meant the heart was losing its rhythm entirely. Push 1 of epi, she said. Her voice came out steady. Not a question. A statement. One of the trauma nurses had already moved to the crash cart, was already drawing up the epinephrine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this exact thing 100 times in scenarios and 6 times in real life. The syringe appeared in her hand like a magician's card trick, and she pushed the medication into the foreline with the kind of pressure that suggested she understood what Danielle understood, that they were watching a man's heart give up in real time, and the person orchestrating it was holding the phone to his ear, explaining to the 7th doctor why career implications were a completely reasonable concern. The 7th refusal came like clockwork. Mercer moved on to the 8th call. His voice had that quality that made the skin crawl. It was sympathetic, really. Understanding. The voice of someone doing you a favor by reminding you how much you had to lose. I completely understand your position. Thank you for being honest about liability concerns. I respect that. Danielle kept compressions going. Her shoulders were screaming now, a different kind of pain, a cleaner kind. The kind that meant her muscles were doing what they were designed to do. Pain is information, she thought. Pain is data. The monitor showed the epinephrine hitting his system, and for a moment, for just a moment, the heart rate climbed one more notch before the rhythm started to destabilize again. 8 refusals now. 9. The room had filled with a kind of terrible quiet, the kind that happens when everyone understands simultaneously that this is a test. Not of medical skill. Not of the colonel's body's ability to survive. A test of whether anyone in this hospital would make a decision that required standing against the careful, methodical pressure of a man who understood how institutions worked. How fear worked. How careers worked. 10 refusals. Mercer was still calm. Still reasonable. His white coat had settled back around his shoulders in that way that suggested he'd never been worried at all. The phone call to the 11th doctor took exactly 4 minutes. The refusal came faster this time. The doctor clearly had heard the same script delivered 6 times before from hospital networks that talk to each other. The careful reminders about liability. The understanding observations about career implications. The subtle suggestion that walking away was not only acceptable but possibly the smartest decision available. Danielle locked her hands again. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The colonel's oxygen saturation on the monitor was dropping now, 68, 64, 61. The kind of numbers that said the body was asking for help in every language biology knew. Mercer picked up the phone for the 12th and final call. His voice on the phone had shifted slightly now. Not more desperate, worse. It had become almost kind. Almost apologetic for putting the doctor in such a difficult position. Almost regretful that career implications had to be a consideration in medicine at all. But they were. And surely the doctor understood that. Surely the doctor agreed that liability concerns were perfectly valid. That the smart play was the safe play. The 12th refusal came through the phone like a bell tolling. And the code room fell absolutely silent. The monitor showed the colonel's heart in complete fibrillation now, that electrical chaos that meant there was no organized rhythm anymore, no heartbeat, just the random firing of cells no longer synchronized. His oxygen saturation was 53. His blood pressure had flatlined. His pupils were fixed and dilated. And standing in the trauma bay of Seattle General in San Antonio at 2:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, with a folded flag from a fallen teammate folded in Danielle's locker on the 5th floor, there was no one in this hospital who would take him to surgery. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Danielle understood, with absolute clarity, that this had always been Mercer's plan. That every phone call he'd made wasn't in desperation, it was in victory. That he'd known before the colonel crashed which doors would open and which would close. That he'd built a cage so carefully, so methodically, using nothing but the fear of other people, that there was no way out. She looked at the security camera in the northeast corner of the trauma bay. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing everything. Then she stopped moving her hands. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing everything. Danielle's hands moved on their own now, muscle memory overriding protocol, overriding fear, overriding the rules that said a nurse couldn't do this. The crash cart tray clattered as she grabbed the scalpel. The blade caught the overhead light, gleaming for a fraction of a second before she pressed it between the colonel's ribs. The skin parted like paper. She didn't feel the resistance. She didn't feel anything except the singular clarity that comes from having done this before, in a desert 3,000 miles away, with rounds kicking up dust around her boots and the radio screaming that air support was still 8 minutes out. This was different only in that the killing wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. The colonel's spleen had torn open and was bleeding him out, slow and certain, and 12 doctors had decided that wasn't their problem. Danielle's gloved fingers slipped through the opening she'd created. The ribs spread under the retractor. She could see the dark blood pooling in the thoracic cavity, black in the harsh fluorescent light. Household forceps, the closest thing to a proper vascular clamp on a crash cart meant for managing overdoses and cardiac arrhythmias, not for saving Delta Force operators who'd been marked for death by a doctor wearing a white coat instead of a gun. She found the severed artery. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, all the rage and fury she'd swallowed for 3 weeks channeling into surgical precision. The forceps closed. The bleeding stopped. She clamped a second bleeder. Her fingers moved like they were reading Braille, finding what was broken and holding it together long enough for the body to remember how to repair itself. The monitor above the bed chirped once. Twice. The flat line rose. A heartbeat. Another. The rhythm climbed like stairs. Sinus rhythm. 204 beats per minute, but sinus rhythm, which meant the colonel's heart was still fighting, still trying to keep him alive despite the dozen surgeons who decided to let him die. She didn't step back. She didn't announce anything. She just stood there with her hands inside a man's chest, holding the line between this breath and the next, the camera above the bed recording every second in high definition with a timestamp that would never be erased. 6 hours 38 minutes and 23 seconds, that's what the security footage would show. The moment Captain Danielle Ross broke every rule that mattered and saved a life that 12 board-certified physicians had decided was acceptable to lose. The next 3 hours were silence. The colonel stabilized. His pressures climbed. His oxygen saturation held. By 5:56 a.m., the first surgical team actually arrived, not because they'd been called back, but because the emergency room attending had finally found someone willing to finish what Danielle had started, willing to take a trained Delta Force operator from a battlefield improvisation to a proper OR where the bleeding could be closed with silk sutures instead of household forceps. The team moved around her like she was already a ghost. The badge deactivation didn't happen by termination letter. It happened by the time she was standing in front of the hospital administrator and the chief of staff at 6:38 a.m., watching Dr. Mercer stand behind their chairs with his arms crossed, his face the color of old brick. The administrator had a folder open on the desk. Inside were photographs. Stills from the security footage. Danielle's hands. The forceps. The blood. The timestamp. "You performed surgery without a license," the administrator said. His voice was careful, measured, the tone of a man reading from a legal document that had already been prepared. "Without authorization. Without a surgical team present. Without any of the protocols that exist to protect patients and the institution." He paused. "We have no choice but to proceed with immediate termination. The liability exposure is catastrophic," the chief of staff added. She was younger, maybe 50, with the exhausted eyes of someone who'd spent the night on the phone with the hospital's legal counsel. "You could face criminal charges. We could face a malpractice suit that." "She didn't authorize a nurse to perform open cardiac massage," Mercer said. His voice was ice. "She performed an unsupervised surgical procedure on a sedated patient. That's assault. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's everything we exist to prevent." Danielle looked at them. Her hands were clean now. She'd scrubbed them in the surgical lounge for 4 minutes, watching the blood spiral down the drain like rust water, and by the time she dried them on a paper towel, she'd already decided what she was going to do. "My nursing credential isn't what you think it is," she said. Her voice was level. She'd never been good at lying, but she'd always been good at telling the truth in ways that sounded like something else. "I was placed undercover at Seattle General by JSOC. Joint Special Operations Command. I'm here investigating medical fraud in military healthcare contracts, specifically the supply chain billing that's being inflated to generate kickbacks." She let that sit for 2 seconds. "The colonel is a protected asset. The investigation is active. And you're looking at an 18-month operation that's about to collapse if you proceed with this." The administrator's face went white. The chief of staff stopped breathing. Mercer's expression shifted, first white, then red, like someone was turning a dial inside his chest from panic to fury. "That's a convenient story," Mercer said. His voice didn't shake, but something in it had cracked. "Prove it." She couldn't. Operational security meant no one would confirm anything. The chain of command that actually existed, the one that had placed her here, the one that had told her to watch and wait and document, would deny everything if asked directly. She'd burn herself to save the operation, and the operation would survive, and she would be just another nurse who'd violated protocol and broken the law. Without verification, the administrator said slowly, "We have to proceed with termination. I'm sorry. But we can't operate under the assumption that." "I want the security footage reviewed for criminal charges," Mercer said. His voice was tight now, controlled, the way a snake sounds when it's already decided to strike. "She performed surgery. She performed it on a patient. She performed it without authorization. That's a felony in this state." The termination happened at 9:15 a.m. They took her badge before she left the building. She drove home in bloody scrubs because she couldn't remember where the locker room was and because nothing in her body was willing to follow the normal sequence of events anymore. The steering wheel was slick under her palms. Her hands shook at every red light. The radio played something about love and loss and she turned it off because she couldn't listen to another human voice right now. Her son was at school when she got home. She sat at the kitchen table. She didn't turn on the lights. The afternoon sun came through the window and illuminated all the places where she'd failed, the kitchen that needed cleaning, the bills that needed paying, the career that had just ended on a security camera recording that would probably be used against her in court. At 3:07 p.m., her 14-year-old son came through the front door. He was supposed to be at soccer practice. He dropped his backpack and found her sitting in the dark with blood under her fingernails and tears that she couldn't stop, her shoulders shaking like someone was hitting her from the inside. "Mom." His voice was small. "Scared. Why are you home? What happened?" She couldn't answer. She couldn't explain that the quiet person in the room, the one who never asked for anything and never made trouble, the one who came home every night and helped with homework and paid the bills and wore scrubs like a uniform, that person had just committed a felony to keep a dying man alive, and the institution had chosen to punish her for it instead. He sat down next to her. He didn't ask again. He just sat there while she broke into pieces, and somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the sound of her own sobs, she heard a helicopter rotor. Or maybe she imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of everything she'd built falling apart. The next morning, her 14-year-old son walked through the sliding doors of Seattle General carrying a shadow box. The frame was mahogany. The glass was clean. Inside, medals hung in precise rows, ribbons the color of old wine and copper, each one catching the fluorescent light like a confession. He'd found them in the garage, hidden behind her winter coats. He didn't understand what they meant. He only knew his mother had come home at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday in bloody scrubs, and now he was going to fix it. He found the hospital administrator in her office on the 3rd floor. His hands shook slightly as he set the shadow box on her desk. "Mom, they need to see these," he'd said, and the words came out exactly as he'd practiced them in the car. The administrator stared at the frame. Then at the boy. Then back at the medals, as if the weight of them might suddenly make sense. By that afternoon, the ICU had transformed into something resembling a courtroom. The colonel sat in his wheelchair by the window, oxygen tubing running to his nose, his shattered body only beginning to remember how to exist without machines screaming at him every 7 seconds. His eyes tracked Danielle as she moved past the nurse's station, and something flickered across his face, recognition, but not the kind that made sense yet. Not until he whispered it. "Angel 6. That's Angel 6. His voice cracked like old leather. The room went dead silent. A Marine liaison arrived carrying a leather folder. His dress uniform was sharper than any knife. He stood at the foot of the colonel's bed and opened the document with the precision of someone performing a ritual, his voice steady as a surgical laser. "Captain Danielle Ross, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Fallujah, disregarding her own safety to extract for wounded operators under sustained enemy fire." Dr. Mercer's head snapped up from the corridor. He moved like a man suddenly on fire. "Stop. Stop right there. Those credentials are fabricated. This nurse submitted false documentation to obtain employment. I have written evidence of multiple medication errors, of protocol violations, of..." The Marine liaison didn't flinch. He kept reading. "Awarding the Silver Star Anne. She's a liar." Mercer's voice had fractured into something uncontrolled. "Check your files. Check anything. She's dangerous and fraudulent, and I have documented proof." The IT specialist stepped forward from the doorway. His name was Clayton. He wore a Navy veteran bull cap, the kind that came from the base exchange at Camp Lejeune 30 years ago. He was holding a tablet. "Dr. Mercer," Clayton said, and his voice had the terrible calm of someone about to read a will. "You asked me to delete the ICU camera files from last night. Specifically, the footage of the surgical crash. You said it was hospital protocol. It wasn't." He turned the tablet around. The screen showed a timeline. Timestamps. Call logs. "I'm former hospital corpsman, 2nd class. 15 years. I know what a cover-up looks like." He tapped the screen. 12 calls. Between 1:52 and 2:19 a.m. Each one to a different surgical team. Each one with the same message: liability concerns, career implications, unauthorized case. You told them to let him die. Mercer's face drained of color. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. That's not, I was protecting. You were protecting a kickback scheme, a new voice said. A two-star general stood in the doorway, uniform crisp as origami, medals that meant he'd made decisions that sent men into places where the light didn't reach. Behind him, two investigators in dark suits flanked Dr. Mercer like parentheses around a confession. The general stepped forward and saluted the shadow box on the administrator's desk. Just a nod, but it carried the weight of institutional recognition. Captain Ross served with distinction. Her credentials are verified through JSOC. Her actions yesterday saved a decorated officer's life. He turned to Mercer. Your actions attempted to end it. The investigators moved in. Handcuffs clicked like a final word. Mercer's hands went behind his back automatically, muscle memory from some long-ago moment when he'd learned that compliance was easier than struggle. The footage will show she acted recklessly, without authorization. She broke protocol, Anne. About that footage, Clayton interrupted. He held up his phone. I sent it to the DOD Inspector General. Also the Texas Medical Board. Also the FBI. 12 calls. Perfect audio. Your voice saying exactly what you said to every single surgeon. You didn't just refuse the case yourself. You made sure nobody else could help him either. The investigators found his office files within the hour. 3 years of inflated billing. Surgical supplies marked up 4,000%. Saline bags costing $2.47 billed at $300. Angiocath needles purchased for $8.95 invoiced at $145. The procurement director who'd been signing off on the fraud was already in custody. The money, $40,000 every single month, had been flowing to Mercer's offshore account with the precision of a surgical drip. He was arraigned that evening. The charges came in layers: fraud, reckless endangerment, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. His medical license suspended within 48 hours. Within 72, every hospital in Texas had flagged his name. By day 5, he wasn't Dr. Mercer anymore. He was just a man named Mercer looking for work. 6 months later, someone spotted him driving a white van marked Midwest Medical Supply Distribution. The van was dented. The paint was fading. He was heading west on I-10, toward a rural clinic outside of Alpine, Texas, the kind of place that didn't ask questions, that was grateful for any help at all. He was no longer allowed within 100 feet of any Department of Defense contract. His medical license was revoked permanently. The quiet, methodical destruction of his career had taken 6 months, and it had been thorough as a surgical excision. At Seattle General, the colonel, Marcus Webb was his name, though everyone still called him by his old call sign, stood for the first time in 9 weeks. The walker was aluminum. His hand shook. The physical therapist stood on one side, Danielle on the other, and neither of them touched him unless he asked. His legs remembered, or his body did something close to remembering. 1 step. 2. The ventilator had been removed. His breathing sounded like a man learning to exist again. He rolled up his sleeve. His forearm was scarred, old shrapnel wounds, pale against darker skin. And there, in black ink, was a name. Danielle Ross. Beneath it, 2 words, Baghdad, 2019. I got this the day after you pulled me out, he said, his voice still rough from the breathing tube. Couldn't remember your face. The trauma, the drugs, everything was static. But I remembered your voice. Angel 6. That's what the team called you. He looked at her. How could I forget? She touched the ink lightly, her finger tracing the letters of her own name as if they were written in a language she'd almost forgotten. I didn't think you'd remember. Her voice was level. Controlled. But something had shifted in it, the careful timidity was gone. Now it was just the voice of someone who'd survived by being competent enough to save a dying man with a trauma knife and improvised equipment, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived worse. The hospital administrator offered her reinstatement that afternoon. Full back pay. A public apology. A promotion to head nurse of the ICU. Danielle declined all of it. Her investigation was complete. Her cover blown. She was being reassigned, effective immediately, to a new position as Chief of Combat Medicine at Bethesda Naval Medical Center, a title that came with a general's signature and the kind of authority that meant she'd never again have to defer to someone like Mercer, someone who confused fear with respect. Her son watched from the doorway of the ICU, finally understanding why she'd come home crying, why she couldn't explain, why the medals in the garage had been hidden like secrets. Clayton, the IT specialist, nodded from his desk when she walked past. The Marine liaison saluted. And in the break room, 8 nurses who'd once avoided her like contagion, nurses who'd been terrified of Mercer's network, who'd been ordered to stay away, stood and applauded. Quietly at first. Then louder. The sound was like rain on hot asphalt after a drought. She didn't smile. She just nodded and kept walking. The transformation was complete. The quietest person in the room had been holding it all together the whole time, and now everyone finally knew it. Like this video if you believe in honoring those who served. If you have military in your family, past or present, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Subscribe and let's keep going.